I'm here with Dr. Imran Hamid. Imran, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure being here. Thanks, Henry.
Would love to hear a little bit about your professional background to start.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a former trauma and orthopedic surgeon, spent a number of years in clinical practice in the UK NHS, and thereafter became a strategy consultant with A.T. Kearney, where I served a number of pharma, medtech, and private equity companies. I was then fortunate to be involved in a digital healthcare startup, and then since then I've had a number of different roles in the new venture and corporate development space with the likes of Merck, Marriott, and J&J Innovation. And more recently, I've been a senior investor at LifeArc Ventures based in the UK.
I think something that I see more and more as entrepreneurs are looking to raise capital and meet fund managers and investors like yourself, while they may have an appreciation for what it takes to raise, they don't fully understand the business of venture capital and how the structure of a fund, where it gets its LPs and who its LPs are, what their strategic interests are, dictate the operations and strategic decision-making of that fund. Can you talk a little bit about that conundrum that you see from entrepreneurs, and is that something you see it, and how would you kind of counsel them on understanding the business of venture capital?
I mean, absolutely. That's one of the key issues that often first-time founders don't really realize when they're speaking to investors. There are often different phenotypes of investors they're interacting with. Typically, you'll see that you'll have your CVCs, the likes of JDDC or Intuitive Ventures, or within the biotech space, you'll have the equivalent of Novartis or Amgen Ventures. They'll be very different to your typical GPLP fund, where it may be like a Gilder or a Sofinova. And then they're also often very different to a LifeArc, where we're operating more as an endowment with more patient, long-term balance sheet capital. And so knowing the differences between those, I think, is really important. The CVC investors will say different things according to the phase of investment they're in. Some will be very strategically focused, looking to fill gaps within their development pipeline. Others may be more general, taking moonshots into the future. And I think as first-time founders, it's important to understand who you're talking to. Are you talking to someone who wants a plug-in for a strategic need, or are they taking a more holistic view? The GPLP funds, again, can be both thematically focused. They may have a specific theme that they raise their capital around, or they may be more generalist in their nature. But again, having those conversations up front to understand what they're looking to invest in and what they're looking to solve for is often a really efficient use of time to focus down that effort.
Yeah. Thinking about those first-time founders that you're referencing there, a lot of them out here at events like LSI, out in the general ether, looking to raise capital. Obviously, it's been a tough few years for capital raising. You were with us last year in Barcelona. If you had to pick one answer, and of course you can explain it, but I want one of the three, is the market today for capital raising better than a year ago, worse than a year ago, the same as compared to a year ago, and why?
So 1 year is not a long time in this space, but I'd say it feels like it's better because I think where last year there was a sense where we hadn't recovered or we're still being a little bit more pessimistic. I think there's a sense things are getting better, although I'm sure other people have a different view on that. And my personal view is since last year, everyone's portfolios have moved on, right? The founders, the entrepreneurs have made great efforts, continue to develop their technologies, develop their products, make progress in market. And the more you get of that, the more confident you're feeling. The flip side is there are a lot of funds who are struggling and they are seeing difficult conversations about down rounds or liquidations, etc. And depending where you are in that cycle, you're going to have a very different view. But I'd say at a personal level, I think things are getting better and we're seeing people getting more confident about getting back into the game and supporting early stage startups.
A lot of people have mentioned that they feel like the sentiment is that some VCs and a lot, maybe strategic VCs or GPLP funds in this tough market have really kind of honed in on portfolio success, focusing on, managing the chickens already in their coop, as opposed to new deals. Is that something you've seen?
I think, yes, that's a reality.
Sure.
Ultimately, you're seeing this dynamic where some GPs are trying to effectively prop up and continue to prove that their fund is retaining and holding value. And that does mean, therefore, they're attracting or retaining their dollars for existing portfolio companies. And therefore, this whole art of syndicating a new round, bringing new investors still remains quite challenging. But my view is over the last 12 to 18 months, there's certainly been more of those conversations and more openness to doing that, because the reality is we can't stay in a status quo. We're just investing in our own portfolio companies. We have to be looking ahead, looking further, and there is certainly indication those rounds are happening.
Good. It's good to see some signs of life there, some positive signals. I want to double click on something you said about kind of VCs propping up portfolio companies a bit and maybe challenge you a bit to take a step back and think about the business of venture capital at a macro level outside of any one particular fund. It's no secret that fund managers are beholden to LPs, and particularly those GPLP funds that don't have a corporate balance sheet that they're drawing for or special strategic interests. they need to return.
Yeah.
And I fear that the DPI problem and the liquidity problem that's plaguing general tech is coming for us and has, already started. As these funds are maybe propping up some of those portfolio companies, those internal metrics may look a lot better than the true capital return metrics are going to look. And I've heard some projections that, vintage 2020, 2021 funds, the top decile of those funds might be a 1x.
Yeah.
Is that going to happen? And if so, what are the implications going to be for those investors trying to raise that next fund, for those companies reliant on some of that early stage capital? What are you seeing there? What's true? What's not true?
So 1x feels a little bit alarmist for that entire vintage. I think the reality, as we all know, there's a huge spectrum of investors operating.
Hey, I'm an optimist, so I like hearing that. But
and I think it comes down to how many of these funds have actually got a multi-year, multi-decade track record and have got a very strong thematic view, a clear strategy, and continue to develop and deploy along that strategy, versus perhaps first-time funds who came in post-COVID when everyone was excited to getting into healthcare, who've probably had their fingers burnt. And I think the reality will be we'll see a separation between those two types of fund managers, and you'll see LPs consistently backing the funds that they've had a longer-term track record with, who maybe experienced a difficult vintage, but know that the team remain consistent, they have a strong strategy, and ultimately some of the footfalls they've had can be explained by that macroeconomic situation. What I would feel slightly more vulnerable for is for founders who've taken money from first-time fund managers. I think that's going to be a really difficult conversation.
Relying on that capital later down the road.
Correct. It may involve reset and valuations, or more difficult conversation with new investors come to the table who may want to do something very different. And I think that is a trickier position to be in.
Let's talk about that moment in time you mentioned around COVID. Lots of investors wanting to get into healthcare, health tech really popping off. Valuations are high. Capital is easy to come by. Interest rates are good. So those companies that raised and had success in that market, some of the valuations, you do a simple back of napkin, even if they grow and continue to hit milestones, they can't possibly live into it in the adjusted market that we are in now. First, who's to blame? And second, what do those companies do? What do the investors in those companies do now when they're thinking about a few years down the line trying to return to LPs?
It may sound a bit of a simplistic argument, but I think the investors are fundamentally to blame. It's upon us to set price, up to us to set valuation. Yes, we know founders will negotiate hard, but ultimately the investors have to take responsibility for that. And it may be that now, ultimately, as we're heading to companies that can't grow into their valuation, they're going to have to be resets that get made. And this is where I think some of the financial structuring is going to look really interesting. I think we're going to get a combination of down rounds or, more structured terms or liquidation preferences. If those companies are continuing to perform and remain investable, the founders and management teams are going to have to be realistic around what that looks like. And I think this is where difficult and more sophisticated conversations are going to happen. It may be that some of the founders then wish to transition out of the company and exec management are brought in to move the company forward. But I can foresee there are going to be a lot of more nuanced conversations happening in the coming years.
Let's talk about that idea of bringing in different management to a company. You look at the great companies, the generational companies, and thinking, not just about med tech, but the, broader high-tech venture capital world. Generational companies are founder-led, right? You invest in the early stages, you meet founders for a living. Obviously, the founder plays a big role in deciding to invest in a company. How do you think about replacing a founder with more seasoned management, when to do that, and the implications on both, the vision, the team morale, ability to execute when you make that decision?
So first of all, it's never a simple or easy or binary decision. The reality is this is a two-way conversation. Often you'll meet founders who are so mission-driven, so skilled, so experienced that they are clearly the founders that can back a company and go ride its journey all the way through. I'd say that's quite rare, and that phenotype is easy to spot, but very infrequent that you come across it. Sure. So for the majority of founders, I think you're looking for a combination of insight and humility, which is a sense of them understanding what they're really good at and then being able to build a team that can take a company to an important and a meaningful inflection point. But then the reality of them really understanding, do they want to continue to go on that journey all the way? Sure. And all the way often means dealing with a different set of investors. Venture investors are very different to growth investors, who are very different to crossover investors. And therefore the demands that those investors, their board, will place on the founders and management will start to change. And it's up to the founders to decide, do they want to be held responsible by very different people and very different characters through the journey of the company. And I think it's important that the first set of investors, or I should say the first investor-founder relationship, has that openness and honesty to it. Because I think it's in that relationship where those discussions are often had. And I've had this experience with some of my portfolio companies where, the founders who either come from a very strong scientific or engineering or product development background, who've been able to sell the story, get sort of seed Series A funds into the business, recognize when the company's making a transition to going into market and becoming commercial stage, they may want a different set of skills around the table, and they're happy to step aside to another exec C-level role, but bring in an experienced manager who can then effectively push the business into that next stage. And it's a very human discussion, but it requires insight on both the investor and the founder's side to make it a successful conversation.
I want to push you a little bit on that. Obviously, your reputation precedes you. I know you speak genuinely when you talk about that two-sided conversation. In your observation, is it really two-sided in most cases? Or is that an approach that you pride yourself on, but in the broader market, is it really majority of the time a two-sided decision? And if it's not, for those firms, how does it affect reputation, ability to win deals? Like, what are the implications of being a fund that replaces founders? Think about like a founders fund, for example.
Yeah.
They never replace the founder, no matter what.
Yeah.
And some may argue that's smart because generational businesses are built by the founders, even if the founder may not be the right, the prototypical CEO for the growth stage, et cetera. You look at the companies that have really made it big. I mean, in medtech, we've had one giant success in the past 50 years. It's called Intuitive Surgical, and Gary Guthart's the CEO. So you could look at that approach as smart, but you can also look at that approach and say, well, if you think a founder should be replaced, it's your fiduciary responsibility to do so. Is it really majority of the time a two-sided conversation? And if not, for those funds that do replace founders, maybe a little bit more by force or by push, what's the implication on their ability to win deals and the trust and the relationship they have with future founders?
It's a very fair observation. And I'd say all funds operate very differently in this space. And it's dependent by stage of the company, the sector you're in, and what the composition of the team is. And the word replacement is actually a very strong word in the sense that for a lot of times what we've seen, it's a transition. It may be that the founder's going from CEO to CTO or CEO to Chief Product Officer.
Something more visionary related to the core product, letting someone else take on the day-to-day responsibilities and management.
Exactly, because ultimately if you think about what the CEO role is when the company's starting to scale, a lot of it is managing the fundraising, managing the financials, managing the team. A lot of that may not be what the founder actually wants to do or is good at doing. And they may be actually a much better position to be in the visionary seat, looking ahead, okay, so what is the next product we're bringing out? How am I building an R&D team to execute on that? Who else do I need to be partnering with to get to that space? And if that's what they're really good at and that's what they love, that's what they should be doing. Sometimes being the CEO seat's not the best seat to be in that. Again, it's dependent on the board, dependent on the investors, dependent on the market they're in. But your question is about, how do you win deals and how do you kind of get the right balance of making that more consensual discussion versus pushing it? The reality is in early stage companies, you can't actually push it because as investors, we're still investing in the people and the teams and the people that they brought along with them. So there may be some heavy-handed investors who try and push people out, but then what they don't realize is the knock-on impact that has on the team that founder has built and the culture of that business. Ultimately, a lot of people in the startup game, they're not being paid a lot. They're not being paid their market value. They're not necessarily having the work-life balance that you could get if you're in another environment. So these people are putting much more than what is obvious into a business. And if you hurt the culture of a company, that has huge implications. And that's one thing as an investor, you've got to be really attuned to. This is why I come back to these are sophisticated, consensual discussions where the founder recognizes that their business is worth more with someone else at the helm rather than themselves, as opposed to being something you just push unilaterally. Yeah. Because I've seen that being done and it may work for 12, 18 months, but then the wheels fall apart because everyone then ends up taking a hit on culture and people leave and then you've got left with nothing.
Yeah. Tell me more about evaluating founding teams, because I've heard some perspectives where when you look at a founding team, maybe there's a group of co-founders or they have some team build out already done when they're coming to you. And some people may say, you're really evaluating the highest spike on the chart. You're evaluating the founder or the person at the helm versus what you're saying is, no, not just the figurehead, not just the tip of the spear, but the team around them, the people that they're coming to you with are people that add value to the culture, have, in kind of entrenched relationships there. And by removing any one of those pieces, you can kind of topple the entire house of cards.
Yeah. Look, it's all about the stories that people tell about successful companies, right? So, everyone thinks about the Zuckerbergs, the Musks of the world, etc. And clearly there's, in a positive sense, a real cult of leadership at the top of the table. And that works for exceptional companies who are very rare to come by. For the majority of successful companies, they've built really good teams. And those teams aren't built on any one individual, but 3 or 4 people who maybe worked together for a long time, know each other really well, are willing to work hard, go through the trenches and back each other through very difficult circumstances. So often what I'm looking for is a team that has that quality. Yes, there may be one star at the table who's the biggest voice, capturing investor attention, maybe they're bringing people together. But what you're looking at is who's around them, who's behind them, who are they pulling through, and do they all work together as a cohesive unit? Because ultimately, that's what you're backing.
Yep.
And that is something that's actually quite hard to figure out. But, when you've been perhaps an operator or an investor for long enough and you can spot those team dynamics, that I think is a key part of the equation.
Yeah. We're talking a lot about evaluating, right? Sourcing, identifying companies that are great, bringing them into the portfolio after winning the deal. Talk about supporting for a moment, because one kind of platitude that I've heard a couple of times, in different conversations is about the value that investors bring. And I think investors a lot of times are quick to put forward that value that they add to companies, whether it's bringing operational expertise, whether it's bringing relationships, whether it's bringing services alongside their fund, all these things. Do investors really add value to companies? Would the great companies not be successful without those great investors as a part of them? Or is it really more a transaction of capital that needs to be injected into the company to give great founders and teams the opportunity to execute, and investors get out of the way?
So the best person to ask that question would probably be a founder, right? They'll have a very strong view on that. But I'd argue as investors, I think it's definitely the former rather than the latter. And, the reality is, and what's often not spoken about, is investors themselves are very competitive, right? They are trying to sell themselves, their services, their funds in front of their LPs. So they'll have a view on how they present themselves to the outside world. The reality is, as much as the sense there are no such thing as the perfect founders, there's probably no such thing as a perfect investor. And there's a continuum of the types of insights and experiences that investors have. And I think it's really important for the founder to know what they might need in their company and the type of investor they're working with. So, at a high level, there'll be investors who have strong scientific or engineering insights. There'll be investors who come with a very strong operating or commercial background. There'll be investors who, are very focused on the financial side of investing. And the reality is you want investors or a group of investors who bring all of that to the table, so that when you as a founder are dealing with issues in any one of those different functional areas, you're getting the right voice coming forward. So your ideal investor should have a portfolio of those experiences and capabilities. And I think when the rubber hits the road, when you're talking about any one of those issues, being able to judge who you go to on your board to solve that, I think is a really important issue to reflect on.
Talking about supporting portfolio companies, you're obviously with them for the long haul, and a big piece of a lot of investor strategies is, using reserves to continue financing those companies. You need to take a big enough bite in order to have the exit be meaningful, and one way to do that is protecting your investment in future rounds, keeping the company capitalized. But how do you know that a portfolio company is one that you want to continue backing? Do investors do a good job of picking their own winners, and is reserves investing a strategy that's destined to fail because investors are better off in the sourcing stage and initial investment than they are in truly picking winners out of their portfolio?
I think there's a lot of nuance to that, in the sense that there are some really good examples where investors have doubled down and continue to back portfolio companies that other investors may thought might be failing, and they've come across really well. LinkedIn is a great example. The Best of Venture Partners investment memo is up there for everyone to read. And, that's a classical story that's often referred to. On the other hand, you'll find that even within a syndicate, investors will have a very different view of the same assets. So, ultimately this comes back down to a combination of objective analysis. And does the market opportunity still ring true? Is the management team still of high quality? Is there real momentum in the business? And being able to almost revisit your investment memorandum and say, does this all stack up? Do we still believe that the reason we put in the check at the first time still holds true? If not, let's have a really honest conversation on what's changed. And do we now need to think differently about this investment? Do we still want to be in here? Do we need to write down the value? Do we need to bring different types of investors who can carry it forward? These are adult conversations that have to be had, and often with management as well, because they need to see that you're struggling with the same issue. And if none of that does head south, the reality is then, is there sufficient momentum in this business? Does the management look like they're able to continue to execute? Are they building advocacy within and external to the business? Are there other third-party partners or investors who want to come into the journey with it? Because a lot of your own internal analysis will lead to a view that you can see. But what you also need to be asking is, what else can other people see? Because other people may have a very different value and perception of the business. I think part of the art is being able to reconcile those different views and come to a view on whether you should continue to be backing that investment.
Last question, and it's a hard one. I want you to kind of think macro around this. Thinking about the venture business model, we have a lot of funds that have gotten too big to fail, essentially become big banks. And they are incentivized more on management fees than returns. They are going to continue to take tremendous management fees off these big multi-billion-dollar funds. And if an LP were to walk away, there's 20 waiting to take their spot. Those funds are incentivized to deploy, pump as much money as they can in. I mean, they love these foundation model companies because they just eat cash. They was incentivized to put money in, raise the next fund. Every emerging fund wants to grow. And eventually, they're going to get over that line where no one winner is big enough to return the fund. And we end up playing this game over and over again. Is the venture model fundamentally broken? Are the incentives fundamentally misaligned between venture and LPs? If so, how do we fix it? And if not, what do you have to do as a fund manager, a senior investor, to preserve the core mission of venture, which is to back great companies and return capital to LPs and have that be your incentive?
Look, I think it's, again, a very fair observation, and I won't be the first person to have a view in this. The reality is we've seen a huge amount of capital go into venture. Everyone can see that. Everyone knows that. All those challenges ring true. I come back to a point that I made earlier on, which is the best fund managers are the ones that stick to their strategy that they know they're good at executing at. Be it they focus on early stage companies where they're backing founders and they're backing the market opportunity, and frankly, there's not more to go on, versus those who are taking bets into the growth stage versus those who are more in sort of mature stages of typical private equity. And I think that transition or drift you see is a real challenge. And you see a lot of people continue to want to take more money and migrate upstream, if you will. The best funds, in my opinion, are the ones that stick to what they're good at. They stick to the strategies that they've had proven success, proven track record, and they execute on that. And I think there is going to be a correction that starts to emerge in the market. And in fact, the reality is we're seeing those signs. I won't name names, but there are a lot of funds out there who are struggling to raise, as they have done in previous years and decades. And I think that's a sign that the LPs are correcting that market dynamic.
Well, Imran, thank you so much for doing this. This is great.